After Trump's big announcement on Monday that there's going to be a 50-day pause before any kind of further action is going to happen against Russia, allegedly to get to a ceasefire, lots of things have been happening since that time. And now we've had a little bit of time also to kind of analyze exactly what he says and what he's promised, especially with some of these weapons to Ukraine, what he's promised to NATO countries, how all that's going to work out. We've started to take a look at some of this, and all of a sudden there's some questions that are starting to arise. And we're trying to assess just how serious this is, just how likely it is to have a positive outcome for the United States and Ukraine. And it's not looking that great. I gotta say, what a shock, right? Well, we have somebody to help us unpack some of this stuff. The first time we've had her on the show today from Defense Priorities, Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis, my colleague at Defense Priorities, who I've had the pleasure of being with on a panel in the university here not too long ago at Brown University. Also, I get to hear her nearly every week on our internal comms. And so now you get the benefit of that. Welcome, Jennifer, to our show.
Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, listen, let's just jump right into it. I want to feature for our conversation today a piece that you wrote yesterday in Responsible Statecraft, which I thought was brilliant, which is why we were excited to have you on here. And one of the first things it says, I think actually the very first sentence, Gary, if you can roll that up, there you go. You said in the first 6 months of his second term, President Donald Trump has demonstrated his love for three things: deals, tariffs, and ultimatums. I wonder if you can just kind of explain a little bit about why you came to that conclusions and whether that's good or bad.
Well, he's been pretty clear since he came into office that he loves tariffs, right? He said it's his favorite word. He has used them extensively for many different policy goals. Rather than focusing on using tariffs just for economic purposes, as previous presidents, he's used them to punish countries for not agreeing to his requested immigration policies, as well as to put pressure on them to change other types of stances towards the United States. So we've really seen, I think, in spades, his affinity for tariffs as a policy tool. Deals is something else that he's talked about since he came in. You know, he's known as a transactional president. He considers himself to be the ultimate deal maker and the ultimate power broker here. And we've seen that throughout, that he has really pushed any sort of deal. And even deals that are kind of empty, that don't actually have much substance, he plays them up, right? It's the making of the deal that's important, not necessarily what's behind it. And then ultimatums, I think we've seen, both in his first term and now his desire to pressure other countries by threatening consequences at the end of some time period, whether it's the repeated threats towards Putin. This time it's 50 days. Other times it's been 2 weeks. Towards Iran, it was 60 days. So there's all these sort of deadlines that he imposes, after which time there will be consequences to pay. And sometimes there are, and sometimes there aren't. But these, I think, are really three trends that we see in terms of how he likes to navigate the world and deal with foreign leaders and other countries, as well as internal stakeholders. So it really jumped out to me that this situation with Ukraine, his announcement on Monday, kind of packaged up all those things that he really loves into one meeting.
You know, I'm curious, since I've got you here, a bit of a diversion, but it's also directly related to the issue of ultimatums. Trump had claimed, or rather others had claimed, that Trump set this 60-day ultimatum for Iran. He said, make a deal or there will be consequences. And many people said, see, he said it. And then precisely on the 61st day, all of a sudden here comes Israel launching this war. And that either implies that it was a coincidence and Israel launched that on itself, or there was direct coordination and cooperation between the two, and Israel was the executing arm of his claim there. But that also came in the light of him claiming right before that, I think 3 days before, that he's going to take 2 weeks to decide what he's going to do with Iran. And all of a sudden, here comes this shock after that. I wonder what your assessment is about how significant or how serious that 60-day ultimatum was.
Well, I don't know that Trump intended it to be that significant, but it's pretty clear to me that Netanyahu took advantage of that 60 days. We know that he had been pressing Trump for some time to at least greenlight an Israeli unilateral attack on Iran, and that Trump had asked him to hold off. And it seems too perfect to be just, entirely unrelated. I think what may have happened behind the scenes is Netanyahu used the 60-day mark to say, hey, your 60 days are up. What are we waiting for? If you back down, you're going to look weak. And so he kind of played on that narrative and took advantage of the fact that Trump had set up the 60 days. I think there's a risk here with the 50-day ultimatum that we end up in sort of a similar situation where Trump is forced to take actions that are actually not in U.S. interests because he has set this ultimatum, and the alternative is to back down. And that's one of the things I write about in the article. So hopefully we can talk more about that.
Yeah, we are definitely going to talk about that. In fact, just kind of to set the stage a little bit for anybody who may have missed it, here's exactly what Trump said regarding this 50 days.
We are very unhappy, I am, with Russia, but we'll discuss that maybe a different day. But we're very, very unhappy with them, and we're going to be doing very severe tariffs if we don't have a deal in 50 days. Tariffs at about 100%. You'd call them secondary tariffs. You know what that means. And that's the way it is. That can be more simple. It's just the way it is. I hope we don't have to do it.
I guess the first thing that I would ask right now is, especially the title of your article was that this 50-day could backfire. Let's first start off with trying to figure out what exactly is the promise here. What has he said is going to happen in 50 days?
Yeah, it's not 100% clear here. He says everyone knows what he means by secondary tariffs. I don't think many people have heard of secondary tariffs until he started talking about it. So I think there's a number of possible ways that could play out. One is that he's talking about 100% tariffs on U.S. trade with Russia. Now that is in and of itself is not a big threat. In 2024, the United States only imported about $3 billion worth of Russian goods, which is not a lot in trade terms. So not going to impose that much cost if you put tariffs on those goods. The alternative is that he's talking about some combination of either tariffs on Russia's trading partners, so countries like China, India, even Europe, and a number of countries in the Middle East that have continued to trade with Russia. They would face either 100% tariffs on their trade with the US or some kind of secondary sanctions, which would affect the specific companies that are trading with Russia. Now that would if executed, that would put pressure on Russia's economy because it would put at risk some of the income that Russia relies on to fuel its military-industrial complex, and some of the only sources that it has kind of a remaining revenue coming in. But historically, the United States has been very selective and only sporadically enforced secondary sanctions because they're very painful, not just on the country that you're targeting, but also those trading partners. So we may not care that China faces secondary sanctions, but there are political and strategic reasons why past presidents haven't wanted to impose that on Europe or India, because these are important security partners that play other roles in U.S. strategy. So it's not really a credible threat against those partners. It's also not all that credible against China if we're talking about 100% tariffs on China. We already tried that. We had 145% tariffs on China, and it didn't work out well for the U.S. economy. So again, not credible. So to me, no matter which one of these options of economic penalties Trump is referring to here, it's not really a credible threat because it's either something that would impose significant costs on the U.S. economy, or something that isn't really going to hurt Russia. So ultimately, I don't think it affects Putin's calculus. It sounds ominous, but there's not that much behind the ominous words.
Yeah, and one of the other things that stood out to me is that's not clear at all from what he said. It's hard to even read between the lines here. What exactly is the deal that Russia is supposed to agree to? What does he want them to have to do in order to avoid these sanctions? Is it just have a unconditional ceasefire? Is it have an end of war negotiations? How do you see it?
Well, he says a ceasefire, but Russia has made it clear that they're not going to have a ceasefire without negotiations. And that's not an unreasonable position to take, because the concern, Russia's concern is that if it has a ceasefire, the United States and Europe will just use that time of halted fighting to rearm Ukraine, and then the war will start again. So, and this is not uncommon in wars generally, that countries will negotiate while fighting is ongoing, but not necessarily just declare a unconditional and total ceasefire. So, I think it's more realistic that maybe you say, okay, in 50 days, we want to be negotiating, but that's not what he says. So it's not really clear what he's expecting Putin to do, and unrealistic that what he's going to get in 50 days is a total halt to all fighting.
So this is looking more shaky by the minute. We're barely 10 minutes in. We had a question from our audience here. Does Jennifer see this backfiring because of BRICS? Before I get you to answer that question, I want to look at something that Lindsey Graham said over the weekend on Sunday that he thought apparently that Trump was going to do. But here's what Lindsey Graham is thinking about some of the BRICS countries.
Congress is on the verge of passing the most consequential sanction package in the history of the country. It will give President Trump tools he doesn't have today, a literal sledgehammer. And the big offender here is China, India, and Brazil. India buys oil from Russia cheap and resells it. That's despicable. I've talked to President Trump. He said last week it's time to move. He's tried to entice Putin to the table, but my goal is to end this war, and the only way you're going to end this war is to get people who prop up Putin, make them choose between the American economy and helping Putin, and you can only have one negotiator, and that's going to be President Trump with maximum flexibility to end this war. China, India, and Brazil, you're about to get hurt big time if you keep helping Putin.
Yeah, that worries me a lot when he's trying to tell these big trading partners that you're either, it sounds like Bush, you're either with us or you're against us. Is it a viable path to make these countries have to choose between the West or Putin?
I mean, I don't see it that way. I think we're in a different world now. We're not in a world where the United States can dictate terms to the rest of the globe. We're in a world where countries have choices. And there's always this threat. Well, where are they going to go? Where else are they going to go? Well, eventually they'll find somewhere else to go. And you see, I think, BRICS becoming more of a significant economic body as countries become sick and tired of the United States using its economic leverage to force policy changes on them. I think India really stands out to me as a country that it's sort of counterproductive to threaten. I mean, Lindsey Graham and others in Congress have also been sort of the biggest backers of the need to be tough on China. And the United States needs to get with its allies and partners and do more to contain Chinese aggression. Well, India plays a really big role in that. If you want to prevent a Chinese regional hegemony in Asia, you need India on your side. So trying to impose significant costs on India seems to me to be very counterproductive. Same thing with Brazil. If this administration really wants to focus on building the Western Hemisphere and reasserting a U.S. sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, well, then it would be useful if you had Brazil on your side instead of Brazil, doubling down on its engagement with BRICS. So I think that these threats, sure, the president could choose to pursue this path, but it would come in direct conflict and really undermine his other policy priorities. I think ultimately, even if these types of threats were carried out, you would see them carried out for only a very short time, because once the consequences start to become clear, I think we'd see the same sort of backing down that we did after the Liberation Day tariffs.
Yeah, that's an interesting phrase that was used back then. Do you see any risk of the U.S. continuing on a path that is proven kind of unsuccessful, very unsuccessful, where we're trying to compel and coerce adversaries or even allies sometimes into doing what we want to at the expense of somebody else, which ends up driving of our adversaries together, like you can say Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, et cetera, a lot closer than they were before February 2022, and a lot of the things we've done since. Does this, on the economic realm, risk the same kind of thing to push so-called adversaries together opposed to us?
Well, I think what it does is the use of tariffs as a primary economic tool creates a wall around the U.S. economy, makes it unappealing to trade with the United States. Other countries are going to keep trading with each other. They're not going to change their global trade strategy because the United States wants to use tariffs. They may decide to trade around the United States, which would mean that the global trading infrastructure will just kind of reroute. And the United States will then be left with many fewer options. So I do think it's, it's very counterproductive because you're not just driving these countries together. And I think part of the reason that adversaries have ended up cooperating more since 2022 was that a big part of Biden's strategy was to isolate them. Well, if you take away all their other options except each other, what do you think they're going to do? Why are you surprised then that they start cooperating more with each other? Iran has like 3 countries on the planet who it can trade with after U.S. sanctions. So obviously it's going to trade with those. So I do think there's a little bit of there's a desire, I think, in the current administration to have all the benefits of U.S. hegemony, but none of the responsibilities and none of the costs.
Ouch.
I don't think it works out that way. If you want to have the benefits of hegemony, which means that you can get countries to do basically whatever you want, you also have to be willing to underwrite the global system. Now, I think you and I probably agree that the U.S. shouldn't be underwriting the global system. I don't want the U.S. to be the security guarantor of the world, and I don't think the United States needs to be the underwriter of the global trading infrastructure. But then I also recognize that means that the U.S. will have to compromise and work with countries as one of many great powers, not as the sole great power.
So, very well said. I agree entirely. There's a complication with some of Trump's deals here. Another way where this could potentially backfire. Really want to get your opinion on this. Mark Rutte went on CNN, I think it was yesterday, and he, of course, he's all excited about this. He was in the Oval Office when the announcement was made, and he talks about some of the get tough part here of what he plans or what he thinks that Trump's plan is going to do. But there's one key thing he leaves off this list. See if you can pick it out.
European allies will buy from the defense industrial base in the US. That can be Patriot systems or missiles or ammunition. And then we will make sure that the US will be reimbursed for whatever European allies are buying.
So Trump says Putin has 50 days to make a peace deal or face these punishing trade consequences. Why do you think Trump's giving Putin 50 days? I mean, this war has now been going on for years. Why not just impose the economic punishments now? You may know in the U.S. Senate, there's a bill supported by 85 senators to sanction Russia.
Yes, I will have dinner after this with Senators Graham and Blumenthal and others who are working on that bill. But I think what President Trump announced today is a real smart way to move forward, because what it basically says to India, to China and to Brazil, so countries still buying from Russia, hey, pick up the phone, call Vladimir Putin and tell him he has got to get serious on peace negotiations. And if he doesn't, then we will be targeted, of course, Russia itself, but also all these countries still buying from Russia. So I think it is a very smart move.
One of the things, these countries still buying petroleum products from Russia, it ain't just China, India, and Brazil. There's a couple of others in Europe, as I recall. How's he going to deal with that?
That's what I was just thinking. I was thinking someone's got to tell him that it's also going to affect Europe. Like newsflash, you're on the hook too. I mean, I think there's a tendency here to overestimate, number one, the willingness of these countries like India and China to call up Putin. They've already tried it, right? They've told Putin that they would prefer peace. But for China, they're perfectly happy to see this war keep going on and the U.S. tied up, expending its munitions stockpiles by aiding Ukraine. I don't think that they have a real burning desire to see the war end. And Russia has been very skillful and has developed ways to get around U.S. sanctions. So there's no guarantee that even if they were imposed, it would necessarily cut off Russian income or the supplies of these petroleum and other types of goods. Russia's been using its shadow fleet and other types of mechanisms to trade these goods anyway. But definitely, I think there's a little bit of blindness there in those comments to the fact that like Europe still buys from Russia as well. And then there's the issues with the munitions piece and the whole plan to the strong military signal.
Yeah. I want to get to that in just a second, but I want to camp out on this piece here just a second here, because a lot of people, especially in the West, are shocked to find out, hey, hang on, we're given all these weapons and we've been supporting this war as the West writ large, since 2022, and we're buying Russian oil. I mean, how did that happen? Because it seems kind of under the radar. People don't like to talk about that much. I wonder if you can explain why that is and why they didn't just cut off the supplies right away to hurt Russia.
Well, I think they have decreased their dependence on Russian oil significantly. Europe has. But for a long time, this was sort of Europe's strategy, right? They got cheap energy from Russia and free security from the United States. And then they spent all of their money on generous social service programs for their populations. That was sort of the European model. And the war in Ukraine, I think, forced them to recognize that they were too dependent on Russian energy. And they've tried to cut off as much as they can. But cutting off this last bit would be very painful, and they're not willing to bear those costs. I think that's a really important point, though, because Europe is always screeching about how this is an existential war, how Ukraine must have victory, whatever that means. And that if Ukraine falls to Russia, Europe is next. Russia's going to invade. So if these things are really true, if this is really an existential threat for Europe, then you would expect Europe to be behaving very differently. You would expect them to cut off oil supplies 100%. You would expect them to invest much more in their own defense industrial base. They're still, they've made a lot of noise now about spending more, but they're still free riding on U.S. military power. So they're not behaving like this is existential. And I think their continued economic ties to Russia is just another sign of the ways in which, they're not willing to bear the ultimate costs for Ukraine. And there are other signals as well. For example, they placed limits on Ukrainian agricultural products being traded in the EU because it's a competition for their farmers. Well, if you really think that Ukraine's survival is existential for your security, then maybe you need to make sure that Ukraine has economic lifelines as well. So I think there's a lot of contradictions here that we in the United States should be questioning when Europe comes begging for more money and more weapons to aid a war that's really much more important for their security than it is for ours.
And so how do you interpret that? Because that's a great comment you made there about the agricultural issue. Another thing that hardly even is known in the West, that there's lots of restraints put on that, a lot of complications. And then also the energy issue with the surface level stuff that does get all the media about the existential threat, et cetera. But what does it tell you about this dynamic? It almost sounds like Jekyll and Hyde kind of thing, or just some really strange, complicated, competing interest of Europe at the same time. What does that tell you about what Europe really thinks?
Well, I think Europe is divided, number one. I think countries that are on Russia's front line are justifiably more concerned about having Russia on their border than, say, Germany and France. So it makes sense for Estonia to be more worried about Russia than Germany. And so I think some of the schizophrenia that you see in EU policy and EU statements, I think, comes from the significant diversity of views that you have even within Europe. But more generally, I mean, even for Estonia and other Baltic states, even for the Nordic states, I think the idea that Russia is going to invade them is unrealistic. Not going to happen. There's lots of reasons why. I think that the playing up of this security threat from Ukraine and their constant talk about this being existential, when we're not seeing changes economically or militarily or politically that would suggest it's existential, reveals sort of an underlying motive here for Europe, which is to keep the United States in. They want the United States tied into Europe. They don't want the United States to pull U.S. forces out of Europe. They're terrified. Even though they've said now that they're ready to stand on their own, they're going to spend 5% of GDP on defense. They're going to spend 5% of GDP on defense in 10 years. Right. So they're not all that committed. They want the U.S. to stay involved. That's their number one priority. They're willing to do anything. We saw the NATO summit, right? The subservience and displayed was kind of gross in my view. So,
right. Yeah.
So
that's a polite way to put it.
So they want to keep the U.S. tied in, and the Ukraine threat is a perfect way to do that, right? Saying that they have this existential threat, this Ukraine war, United States needs to keep arming Ukraine, must stay involved. And this deal, this munitions deal where Europe buys European arms, they've gotten Trump now to make this political shift to backing Ukraine, is exactly what they wanted, because now it's much harder for Trump to back out. So I see them playing up this Ukraine threat as a way to keep the United States tied into Europe, because they don't want to have to stand on their own 2 feet.
And, you know, and in that same regard, it seems to me that a lot of this lathering up of Trump that you kind of referred to is almost, and I've heard some people suggest this, and like your view on it, that this is all designed to say, okay, he's already had one term, so unless something really weird happens in the United States, he's only got this term, which is, 3.5 more years from now. So let's just push these the criteria just a little bit on the other side, and then we'll get somebody a little bit more amenable into the White House that'll get back to situation as normal, and we'll probably never get to that 5% anyway. How do you see that?
Well, I do think there's a recognition in Europe that there are changes happening in U.S. foreign policy, and that that Trump isn't an outlier in terms of his frustration with Europe, that there is significant frustration with Europe and desire to reduce U.S. commitments, especially on the right, which would mean that almost any new president following Trump that was sort of from like the new right, and you're almost guaranteed to get somebody in that genre if you got a Republican president next, because most of the sort of old guard are sort of on their way to retirement. So I think there's a recognition in Europe that things have changed and that they do need to spend more on defense. That said, I think you're right that they are hoping they can just kind of get through these 4 very unpredictable years. And then on the other side, they'll get someone that's a little bit easier to work with, or a little bit easier to predict, or to get some kind of timeline from. And then, over 10 years, I think there's a hope they can just keep kicking the can down the road, keep the U.S. involved, maybe shift things a little bit, but not that much. Who knows how many countries will actually make it to 5%? They've given themselves an out of having this 1.5% in like related spending, which could be like building roads in their country. So, I think that there's a lot of flexibility. Who knows what other kind of creative accounting they'll come up with. So I do think that there is a little bit of a game here going on. But I also do think there have been changes in Europe, not enough, but some changes to recognition that like Biden was the last of the like great transatlanticists, and that they do need to do more. But I think you and I, I would like them to be completely independent of the United States and for there to be no forces left in Europe. I don't think that's like that. I don't think Europe sees that as their end goal.
Yeah, because this honestly, the whole thing of this sort of as a side note, this whole thing about NATO made a great deal of sense in 1949 and mutual interest and benefits for everybody, but there shouldn't be this literal permanent NATO alliance into perpetuity, like forever. There has to be an end to it somewhere where nations have to provide for their own national security. But I digress. I want to get back to your article here, because one of the other things you talked about, I think, is really important for people to understand. And it's a combination of 2 things. Number one is how fast can these even limited number of interceptors and artillery shells and whatever else is going to turn out to be in this package. We still don't have a lot of details. And then how many can we afford to give? Those are 2 big deals. There's here, Bridge Colby recently was cited as somebody in the Wall Street Journal here that apparently he tried to get a pause in the supplies to Ukraine before all this stuff happened with Trump, because we had already depleted Pentagon stockpiles. There's this piece here from 2023, a study that was done by, I think it was Seth Jones. If you can put that second one up there. Seth Jones here in 2023, where he did an analysis of if we got into a war with China over Taiwan, that he said that we would run out of a lot of our key precision-guided munitions, and it could occur within a week if we got into a full-out war with them, i.e., our industrial capacity is not that great. Our stockpiles weren't that great in 2023. Since that time, I mean, you've got what we did within 2024 with Iran and Israel, helping them shoot down stuff. We've had the 2024 to 2025 issue with both Trump and Biden trying to, quell the Houthis in the Red Sea. That didn't work out very well. Now then, this 12-day war on top of what we've already sent to Ukraine, and now we're going to send some more. Question is, do we have it to give? And what is the risk if we keep doing it?
Yeah, well, I do think, munition stockpiles are quite depleted. I think the munitions that Seth focused on in his report are a little bit different than the interceptor missiles that Bridge Colby is worried about. But that doesn't change the fact that the United States has missile shortages across the board. This latest deal, I think, is still a little bit unclear. The details are still being worked out, where exactly the weapons are coming from. And like what the mechanism is. There's three basic possibilities. One is that these are going to be missiles taken and other material taken out of European stockpiles, sent to Ukraine, and then backfilled with U.S. new production. That would mean that Europe would be waiting for some time to get that backfill. Another is that Europe is going to pay for PDA for withdrawals from U.S. stocks. And then that's going to be backfilled from U.S. production. That would immediately affect U.S. readiness because it would draw down already depleted stocks. The third way is that Europe is just going to straight up buy new production. That wouldn't necessarily have quantity limits, but it would have time constraints. It would not get to Ukraine for months or years. So not going to be very helpful for the near term. So I think there's a couple implications here. The first implication is that what can arrive quickly on the Ukrainian battlefield is quite limited in a quantity and type of weapon. It's not going to change the military balance. So this is not a big change or a game changer for Ukrainian military. Maybe it helps them solidify their defensive lines a little bit, but maybe not given their manpower challenges. So that's the first point. The second point is that no matter how this occurs, basically it continues to affect U.S. readiness. Most significant readiness effects would be if it came from U.S. stockpiles, because that would be immediate drawdown. But even if new production is the source, or new production is being used to backfill Europe, it's still missiles and weapons that are not going into U.S. stockpiles. It's still diversion. There's no Ukrainian production line that's running separately from the production line that feeds U.S. military forces. It's one production line. So if we're diverting that material to Ukraine, it's not getting to U.S. forces.
How much, do you have any idea how much the production capacity, and then we'll just keep it narrowed in a couple of different categories, for interceptor missiles and 155 millimeter artillery shells, that the U.S. has expanded its capability from when the war started? I know during the Biden administration, there was several contracts that were given out. Do you have any sense for how much more our capacity is than it was at the beginning?
Well, it's more, but it's not that much more. So at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I think we can make 500 Patriot interceptors a year, and now we can make 600. I mean, that's great. We can make 100 more. Not really going to solve the problem when you expend them at such a quick rate, because it's important to any missile that's fired requires multiple Patriot interceptors. So as an example, when the U.S. forces at Al-Udeid Air Base were targeted by 14 Iranian missiles, it took over 30 Patriot interceptors to respond to that threat.
Oh, wow.
So if you're facing a big missile barrage, you go through these quite quickly. So that's with Patriots. I think Stinger missiles, the Stinger production line was shut down completely. It's restarted now, and we can produce about 60 a month. Not that impressive. For the 155 millimeter ammunition, I'm not exactly sure where it started, but the goal was to get up to I think 100,000 a month, which would put you at 1.2 million per year. And we kind of have stalled out here at about 60 or 65,000 a month. Not really clear what's slowing things down, but there's a number of possibilities. One is the role of tariffs, which we talked about earlier, has disrupted supply chains. Another is the rare earth issue with China. Some of these missiles and other technologies do require inputs still that we are dependent on from China. And the third is that there was a big fire at the Radford facility in the United States that kind of destroyed some production capacity. So the bottom line is making progress towards increasing these stockpiles, but the progress is still much slower than the demand.
What is the difference from an economic perspective and a national perspective? So Russia started its war vastly overestimating what would happen when it fled their forces into Ukraine. I think they thought it would scare Ukraine into capitulation right away, and they wouldn't have to fight a long war, because they were definitely not set up to have a sustained war of attrition kind of deal. It took them easily a year and a half to build up to that, but they were facing, an existential crisis of their definition, and so they converted all kinds of industry and ramped up all kinds of stuff and just pulled out all the stops in many cases. On our side, though, we're not fighting, so we have marginally expanded our capacity. How hard would it be for the U.S. government, say, to really try to put some pressure on the defense industry and say, hey, I need you guys to double what you're doing here, and you can pick a category? Because it seems like to me, from the private company perspective, they're like, hang on, it would take us a year and a half to ramp up to this. What if the war's over in 6 months from now? Now what are we going to do? How hard is that to do?
I mean, I think it is quite difficult, and there's a number of factors. One is, as you alluded to, that contracts for defense production tend to be short term, which don't give defense production companies like Lockheed and others the incentive to build up the long-term capacity, because they're worried that then the war ends and they have this slack capacity that they can't use. Even if they weren't worried about that, it would take them some time to build up the production capacity. The United States hasn't been a manufacturing superpower for some time, so it would require building a lot of infrastructure. Another constraint that we face here is workforce. The United States does not have the workforce to man these facilities, and that, I think, is actually the biggest concern, because you can imagine that with enough money, you could build more factories and expand production lines quickly, but training the workers takes a lot longer, because not anyone can be trained to build these types of munitions, especially some of the more sensitive ones, which require security clearance, because then you have to find people who haven't been,
right. Good point.
Don't have any sort of black mark on their record, no debt, no defaults on credit cards, no recent drug use.
That's
right?
pretty hard.
Well, you're really starting to. The rules are quite strict, and so you're really starting to rule out people. At a
I've never thought about that. That's good, especially with the missiles. I know that's all classified stuff, and yeah, that's a big issue.
Yeah. So it's not impossible, but it would require significant policy changes, as well as just the political will to kind of reorient an economy towards industrial production. And I don't know that exists. It exists in Russia because of the nature of the government. They can decide how much they want to turn their economy into a war machine, which is effectively what they've done. Not 100%, but effectively. That would be a lot harder in the United States, especially when, I think policymakers talk about Ukraine being important, but they have to recognize that at the end of the day, what happens to Ukraine is not going to affect U.S. security. So are they willing to bear the political costs of making these significant economic changes? And again, we see that, no matter what politicians in the United States or Europe say, we can tell what they really think by their actions and their willingness to bear the real costs.
Now, I think that we can both agree that there are a lot, and you just named most of the key ones, hard constraints to actually expanding the capacity out, to become, quote, the arsenal of democracy again, like we allegedly were during the World War II or something, where we did produce a great deal of stuff here. But it worries me that we're not folding our policies to match the actual realities and the constraints that we have, because it seemed like that should cause a bit of an appetite suppressant on what we try to do. But so far, it seems like we're just ignoring these hard constraints and just having policies as though there are no constraints. And what is the risk if we keep going down that path?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I do think it's a risk. I think, as munition stockpiles get lower, and if we continue to go on the trajectory we're going of, continuing to arm Ukraine at significant levels, no matter how we do it, continuing to play a big role in the Middle East, especially if there were to be another blow up between Israel and Iran, or the United States and Iran, you start to limit policymaker flexibility because you get to levels where your munitions are no longer sufficient to be as responsive as you want to be. Right now, the United States is very used to being able to choose where it intervenes. And so the big debate whenever something pops off is, should the U.S. get involved, right? Like, is this in U.S. interests? Should the U.S. use its military power here? But you get to a point where it's no longer a should the U.S. be involved, but can the U.S. be involved?
Yeah.
Because either because the United States does not have the stockpiles to support it, or because it cannot protect U.S. forces were it to get involved. And so I think this is really important when you think about Asia. The debate now in D.C. often is like, should the U.S. defend Taiwan? Well, at some point you get to critical levels of munitions where the question isn't should, but could. And the U.S. could be sidelined in a conflict because it simply cannot stay in the fight and cannot support U.S. forces. And, I'm not someone who I actually don't think the U.S. should defend Taiwan. So it's not just about Taiwan. It's about any sort of crisis that actually really affects U.S. interests. We want missiles for those crises, and we don't know when they're going to occur. And because production lines are so slow, you can't find the crisis and then arm for the crisis. You have to be ready for the crisis when it happens. And so that's my concern.
Well said. Yeah.
My concern is that policymakers will no longer have the should question. It will be a can we.
Yeah. I think we should highlight that question a lot more than we do, because too few people are aware that's even a question to ask. Moving on, I want to look at the significance or the potential efficacy of this 50-day threat against Russia. The question is, can this compel Putin to do what Trump wants, or might it harden him to do whatever Putin wants?
I don't think it really factors into Putin's calculus, to be honest. I mean, I think
that's almost sadder.
I mean, I think he's not worried about the consequences that Trump has threatened. He's not worried about that additional U.S. military aid is going to, cause his front lines to collapse. He still has the military advantage on the battlefield. He's not that concerned about the economic threats that Trump has made. In fact, the Russian stock market went up after Trump's announcement, which suggests that even Russian investors believe that the Russian economy is able to withstand this 50-day threat. It does give Putin now 50 days to kind of consolidate his gains. Maybe there's an incentive here to, push hard through the summer and consolidate gains and then move towards negotiations in the fall. I kind of thought that there might be an opening for negotiations in the fall, no matter what. So I'm not sure that Trump's threat or ultimatum really factors in there. But the bottom line here is that Putin has staked far too much on this war to decide to end it artificially or sooner than he wants, because Trump has because of Trump's deadline. He has his whole legacy now is basically whatever happens in this war. And so he has a set of objectives that he wants to achieve, and he's willing to push to get them. And he is patient and believes that Russia has the advantage and can continue fighting for some time. Now the costs will get higher, and he knows that. He could be forced to mobilize, do a second mobilization. He could be forced to make additional changes to the U.S. economy that would be difficult to undo after war. But I don't think that he is afraid of taking on those costs to achieve his goals. So ultimately, I don't think that Trump's ultimatum forces Putin to the negotiating table. It only really puts Trump in a hard situation, because now at the end of 50 days, he's going to have to decide when Putin's not at the negotiating table waiting for him, is he going to impose these economic penalties and threats, which will end up having blowback on the U.S. economy, or is he going to back down and risk looking weak?
Yeah, that's not a lot of good options there. But like you say, we'll have to wait and see how it's going to work out, because we don't have the leverage really to make good on this ultimatum. But we'll see how that plays out. Listen, before I let you go here, I know we're getting close to the end here, but I want to ask you what your view is on a separate issue that was some breaking news this morning, that Israel has attacked some Syrian targets again this morning. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what's going on with that, if you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we're still all kind of trying to get information on what's going on. Israel has been concerned about the supposed threat to its security from Syria. I think it is concerned about the new Syrian regime and has actually been trying to undermine it. It would prefer to have a weak and unstable country on its border to something that is more consolidated. And the current government does seem to be making progress towards consolidating control over its military and over its territorial space, and it has some backing from the U.S. in terms of reducing these sanctions. And the latest bombing, suggests that that Netanyahu is not going along with the U.S. plan here to bring Syria into
Oh,
the
what a shock that is, huh?
yeah, but is instead pushing his plan now. Whatever the military threat is that he supposedly sees coming from Syria, I think the ultimate goal here is really just to keep his neighbors weak. And to expand Israel's territory, if not formally, by all these buffer zones that it creates, right? Like buffer zones that it creates in Gaza, buffer zone that it creates in Lebanon, buffer zone that it creates in Syria, and really this desire to act at will. Even though the ceasefire with Lebanon is still ongoing, Israel is bombing Lebanon at a consistent basis, right? So I think
I saw some more this morning as well.
Yeah, so I just see this as a continuation of this policy of Israel sort of acting with impunity militarily to keep its neighbors weak and expand this buffer zone around its territory. And of course, it does this with U.S. backing, right? There are some people who say like Israel is becoming like the military hegemon of the Middle East. Well, only because the United States is underwriting its activities. It would probably behave much differently if it didn't think that it would have the U.S. coming to its aid in a crisis.
But what's and we don't have, I'd love to have you back and we can just talk about this subject in more detail, but just real briefly, what is, as far as you can identify, what is Israel's objective here? Because just launching these kinds of strikes, and nothing has been solved with the Houthis, nothing has been solved with Hamas, nothing has been solved with Hezbollah other than a ceasefire, but obviously that's continuing on. And now here they've added Syria to the mix. Nothing has been solved with Iran. They just stopped fighting for a while. All the issues are still on the table. What is the end game for Israel? They can't just become a permanent army state, can they?
Well, I don't know. It's a little bit hard for me to see sort of what the end goal is because it doesn't seem to be all that strategic in my view. They seem to be gaining a lot of tactical wins, but not many strategic wins. And so the strategy really seems to be guided by what's best for Netanyahu politically, and sort of a very near-term approach. I think the ultimate hope is that eventually they'll be able to put enough pressure on Iran that Iran will collapse, and that will lead us towards the new Middle East that everyone's talking about. Now, to me, that just sounds like a fairy tale, makes me nervous because it sounds way too much like the whole idea of Iraq becoming
this
glorious democracy. I think ultimately Israel feels most secure when its neighbors are weak and destabilized, and it uses military power to keep them weak and destabilized.
Yeah, and that's just not sustainable over the long term. And as you say, that's dependent upon a steady flow from the United States in terms of enablement, both diplomatically as well as militarily. And that just can't go on forever either, just physically. But anyway, we'll have to leave it there for right now. I'd love to talk to you more. I'd love to have you back on. Thanks so much for coming on today. This has been very, very enlightening, and we really appreciate your time.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It was great, and I'd love to come back.
Good. And we'll thank you. And let's let you know, we have Larry Johnson coming back on at 1:00 today. He's going to be talking about how Trump seems to be kind of unreliable on some things. We talked about it a little bit here, but when you look at it in a broader scope and, like what's going on with these Epstein files, they want them released, they don't want them released. There's a lot to unpack here, and it's always great to have Larry the Shirt Johnson. Be sure and join us at 1:00 today, and we will see you then on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.